Fishing had always been my escape. I'd been doing it since I was a kid, learning from my grandfather who would take me to his favorite spots on the lakes and rivers near our town. Something was calming about being out on the water, away from everything. The quiet, fresh air and the feel of the line in my hands were like nothing else. That's why, when life got overwhelming a few years ago, I decided to take a solo trip to clear my head. I was going through a rough patch, work was draining, my relationship was falling apart, and I needed some space. I figured a few days of solitude would help me think straight. I had heard about this remote lake from a guy at the bait shop. He told me it was way off the beaten path, somewhere deep in the woods. It was supposedly untouched, and the fish there were massive. He mentioned it with a strange grin on his face, like he was hiding something, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I was too desperate for an escape. The drive out there took longer than expected. The roads turned from paved to dirt, and eventually I had to leave my truck behind and hike in. The path was overgrown and winding, but I eventually found the lake just as the sun was beginning to set. It was perfect, completely isolated, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to swallow the shoreline. The water was eerily still, reflecting the fiery orange and pink sky. It was peaceful, but at the same time, it felt too quiet. Not even the usual sounds of birds or crickets. Just silence. I set up camp near the water, pitched my tent, and started a small fire. As I sat there eating my dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every now and then, I thought I heard movement in the woods behind me, like twigs snapping or leaves rustling. But whenever I looked, there was nothing there. I chalked it up to nerves or wildlife, though, and brushed it off. After all, I was alone out there. There was no one for miles. The first day of fishing went great. I caught several bass, bigger than anything I'd seen in years, but that strange feeling never really left me. I'd glance over my shoulder every now and then, convinced I'd catch something or someone watching me from the tree line, but again, nothing. Still, by nightfall, I was feeling good. The fishing was excellent, and I was starting to relax. For that night, things took a turn. It was sometime after midnight when I woke up to a soft splash in the lake. At first, I thought it was a fish, maybe jumping or hitting the surface. But then, I heard another splash, and this time, it sounded different. Like something big, slowly moving through the water. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, poking my head out. The moon was high, casting a pale light over the water. I scanned the lake but didn't see anything unusual at first. Just the same stillness as before. I was about to shrug it off when I noticed something floating about 20 feet from the shore. It was hard to make out in the darkness, but whatever it was, it didn't belong there. It looked like a log or some debris, but it was moving slowly, drifting toward the shore in a way that logs shouldn't. I stood there for a minute, gripping the flashlight tighter, staring at it. As it got closer, I realized it wasn't a log at all. It was a head, a human head, barely visible above the surface of the water moving toward me. I froze. My mind tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was some sort of animal, something floating by. My mind couldn't make sense of it. But as it got closer, there was no denying it anymore. It was a person's head, just bobbing there in the water, facing my direction. But what was worse, it wasn't swimming or struggling. It was just drifting. My heart started racing, and I backed away from the shore, keeping the flashlight trained on the water. The head was getting closer now, only about 10 feet from the bank. I tried to shout something, but my voice caught in my throat. My entire body was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I just stood there paralyzed with fear, watching this thing come toward me. Then, without warning, it disappeared beneath the surface. One moment it was there, staring at me, and the next it was gone. The water rippled slightly where it had been, but after that, everything went still again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat inside my tent, clutching my flashlight, jumping at every sound I heard outside. I kept replaying the scene over and over in my head, trying to convince myself that it was just a nightmare, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I saw. By morning, I had decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed up as fast as I could, keeping one eye on the lake the entire time. The sun was up, but that did little to calm my nerves. Every time the wind rustled the leaves or a branch snapped, I felt that same sick feeling in my stomach. I was halfway through packing when I heard it again, a splash, louder this time, coming from the same spot as last night. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I slowly turned toward the lake and there it was again, the head. Except this time, it wasn't just drifting toward me. It was closer, only a few feet from the shore, and rising higher out of the water. I could see more now, a pale face with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to lock onto mine. Its mouth hung open in a twisted, unnatural grin, and the rest of its body started to emerge from the water, crawling onto the bank, dragging itself toward me. I grabbed my gear and bolted. I didn't care about what I left behind. I just needed to get out of there. I ran through the woods, my heart pounding in my chest, not daring to look back. The whole time, I could feel it behind me, chasing me, even though I never heard footsteps. The only sound was my own panicked breathing and the crashing of branches as I sprinted toward my truck. I didn't stop running until I was behind the wheel, the engine roaring to life. I peeled out of there, leaving the lake far behind me. But that image of the thing, its hollow eyes, that twisted grin, has never left my mind. To this day, I have no idea what I saw. I've tried to find that lake again, just to see if it was real or if I somehow imagined the whole thing. But no matter how hard I search, I can't seem to find the path. It's like the place doesn't exist. But I know what I saw and I'll never go fishing alone again.
A few years back, I went on a fishing trip that still haunts me to this day. I had been looking forward to it for weeks, a remote lake up in the mountains, miles away from civilization, where the only sounds you'd hear were the wind in the trees and the splash of a fish hitting the surface. I was craving solitude, the kind you only get deep in nature. I didn't realize how alone I'd really feel. It was a lake my buddy Jason had mentioned to me before. He said his uncle used to take him there as a kid, but he hadn't been back in years. According to him, it was the perfect fishing spot, hidden, off the grid, and teeming with fish. The only downside was that it was a bit of a trek. There were no marked roads, just old logging trails that had been swallowed by the forest over time. That sounded perfect to me. After packing my gear and loading up my truck, I set out early in the morning. The drive was peaceful at first, winding through scenic mountain passes, the kind of roads that make you feel like you're the only person in the world. After a few hours, I hit the logging trail Jason had told me about. It was rough, overgrown, and barely visible, but I managed to push through. By the time I reached the lake, it was late afternoon. The place was exactly what I'd hoped for, completely isolated, with water as smooth as glass. No boats, no people, not even a trace of recent visitors. I set up camp on a small clearing near the water, pitched my tent, and grabbed my fishing rod. The first couple of hours were uneventful but peaceful. I cast my line and sat there, letting the quiet sink in. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the water and the occasional breeze rustling the trees. But as the sun started to set, things changed. It was gradual at first, a strange tension in the air, like everything had suddenly gotten quieter. Even the wind had stopped, and the water looked unnaturally still, almost like it was holding its breath. I chalked it up to my nerves. Being alone in the wilderness can play tricks on your mind, but then I heard something, a low, faint sound like a distant whisper. It came from across the lake, so quiet at first that I thought it was my imagination. But as the minutes passed, it grew louder. It wasn't wind or wildlife, it was a voice unmistakably human. I stood up, scanning the opposite shore, but there was no one there. Just trees, thick, dark trees that stretched as far as I could see. I strained to listen, trying to make out what the voice was saying, but it was impossible to tell. It was like someone was muttering under their breath, just loud enough to be heard but too quiet to understand. That's when I noticed something strange. A figure standing near the tree line on the other side of the lake. It was hard to make out through the fading light, but there was no mistaking it. A tall, dark silhouette, perfectly still, just standing there, watching. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a shadow or a weird reflection off the water. But as the minutes passed, it didn't move. It just stood there, staring across the lake at me. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was probably just another fisherman, someone who'd hiked in from the other side. But the more I stared at the figure, the more unsettled I became. It was too still, too silent. I couldn't even see any details, just this unnerving dark shape against the trees. And then, just like that, it was gone. 1 second it was there, and the next, it vanished, swallowed by the shadows of the forest. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my eyes fixed on where the figure had been. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but something deep inside me knew that wasn't true. There was someone, or something, out there. As night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to relax by the fire, convincing myself I was just being paranoid, but the woods around me felt too quiet, too dead. I didn't hear any animals, no crickets, not even the usual rustling of leaves. Just this suffocating silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I thought about packing up and leaving, but it was already too dark to navigate the trail. Besides, I hadn't driven all this way just to turn back at the first sign of weirdness. So, I stayed. I lay in my tent, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound, anything to break the silence. Around midnight I heard it again, the whispering. But this time it was closer, much closer. I shot up in my sleeping bag, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was unmistakable now, a soft, guttural whisper, like someone speaking just outside my tent. I held my breath, trying to make out what it was saying, but it was the same as before. Just quiet, unintelligible muttering. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it around the tent. Nothing. But when I turned the beam toward the lake, I saw it. That figure again, standing on the shore, much closer this time. It was just standing there, motionless, watching me from the edge of the water. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark, human-like shape. But there was something horribly wrong about it. Its posture, its stillness, the way it seemed to just blend into the darkness. Without thinking, I scrambled out of the tent and shouted at it, hoping it would scare whoever it was off. But the figure didn't move. It didn't react at all. It just stood there, completely silent, as if waiting for something. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, but I was frozen in place, my mind racing. And then, just like before, the figure disappeared. It didn't run or move. It just vanished, as if it had never been there. That was enough for me. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands trembling. I didn't care how dark it was or how dangerous the trail might be at night. I wasn't staying another minute in that place. As I threw my bag into the truck and turned the key, I glanced one last time at the lake. In the glow of my headlights, I saw the figure again. This time, it was standing in the middle of the lake, the water lapping around its legs, watching, waiting. I floored it, driving as fast as I could down the dirt path, not daring to look back. To this day, I have no idea what I saw. I've never been able to shake the feeling that something followed me that night, something that still watches me from the shadows whenever I'm alone. And I'll never go back to that lake again.
I've always been an avid fisherman. There's something about the quiet, the patience, and the thrill of the catch that always drew me in. Living in a small town, there wasn't much else to do, and over the years I'd explored most of the lakes and rivers in the area. But there was one spot I hadn't ventured to yet, a small, secluded lake deep in the forest. It wasn't on any maps, and you'd only hear about it through word of mouth from the locals. They called it Shadow Lake. It wasn't a well-known place, and whenever I asked around about it, I'd get strange looks or vague answers. People would change the subject or shrug it off like it wasn't worth talking about. The few that did speak of it would say it was dangerous or not worth the trek, but no one ever gave me a concrete reason why. That only piqued my curiosity more. I finally decided to check it out one weekend. I figured it would be the perfect escape from my usual routine, a place where I could fish in total solitude. I packed my gear, loaded up my truck, and set out early Saturday morning. The drive wasn't too bad at first, but as I got closer to where Shadow Lake was supposed to be, the roads turned rough, more like narrow dirt paths, overgrown with weeds and roots. Eventually, I had to park and hike the rest of the way in. The trail was barely visible, more of a suggestion than a path, winding deeper into the woods. The trees here were taller, older, and they seemed to close in the further I walked. There was an unnatural stillness to the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath. But I pushed on, determined to reach the lake. After what felt like hours of hiking, I finally broke through the thick underbrush and stood at the edge of Shadow Lake. It was smaller than I'd imagined, but eerily beautiful. The water was dark, almost black, and perfectly still, reflecting the twisted shapes of the trees surrounding it. There were no birds, no bugs buzzing, not even the usual ripple of fish under the surface. Just silence. I set up my gear at the water's edge and cast my line, trying to ignore the strange vibe of the place. The water looked deep, and I was sure there had to be some big fish lurking beneath the surface. But after an hour of fishing, I hadn't gotten a single bite. I wasn't ready to give up just yet, so I cast again, sitting back on the shore and letting my thoughts drift. That's when I noticed something odd. There was a strange shadow moving just beneath the surface, gliding slowly through the water. At first, I thought it was a large fish or maybe a submerged log being pushed by the current. But the water wasn't moving at all. There wasn't even the slightest ripple. The shadow was the only thing that seemed to be moving in the lake. I watched as it passed under my line, not paying it much mind at first. But then it stopped, directly beneath where my line was cast, and stayed there. That's when I felt it, a sharp, unnatural tug on my rod, like something had latched onto the bait. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively yanked the rod back, expecting to feel the familiar resistance of a fish fighting on the line. But what I felt was much heavier. It was like I'd hooked something massive, something too large to be a fish. My arms strained as I tried to reel it in, but the weight was unbearable, like whatever I had snagged was pulling back, refusing to surface. My excitement quickly turned to fear. This wasn't normal. I kept reeling, my heart pounding in my chest. The water still didn't ripple, didn't move, but I could see that shadow getting closer, rising toward the surface. My breath caught in my throat as the shape took form beneath the dark water. It wasn't a fish. It was a hand. A pale, bloated human hand, reaching up from the depths, fingers splayed, as if it was trying to grab the line, or worse, grab me. I froze, unable to move, as the rest of the figure slowly emerged from the lake. First the arm, long and unnaturally thin, then the face, a face that looked swollen and twisted, like it had been underwater for far too long. The eyes were sunken, hollow, staring right at me. The figure kept rising, its body dripping with black, murky water, until it was standing waist-deep in the lake, still holding onto my line. Its mouth opened slowly, and a garbled, wet sound escaped, like it was trying to speak, but all that came out was a gurgling moan. I stumbled backward, dropping my rod, my heart racing. I don't know how long I stood there staring at this thing. Time seemed to slow down, and all I could focus on was that figure, its empty eyes locked onto mine. Then, without warning, it started moving toward me, pulling itself through the water, its movements slow but deliberate. I snapped out of my trance, grabbed my gear, and ran. I didn't even look back to see if it was following me. I just bolted through the trees, tripping over roots and tearing through branches as I tried to get as far away from the lake as possible. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart in my ears. When I finally made it back to my truck, I threw my gear in the back and floored it, not stopping until I was miles away. Even then, I couldn't shake the image of that thing in the lake, that bloated face staring at me, reaching for me. I haven't been back to Shadow Lake since. In fact, I've barely gone fishing at all. I don't know what I saw that day, whether it was some kind of ghost, a drowned spirit, or something worse. But I do know one thing. That lake isn't just a fishing spot. There's something wrong with that place, something dark. And I'll never forget the feeling of that line pulling back, as if it wasn't a fish I was reeling in, but something far more sinister, something that still lingers in the depths of that lake, waiting for its next catch.